It's been great. And now we have to move to our final speaker, at least for this session, Dr. Sam Hay. Sam is a lecturer at Alpha Crucis University College and Christian Heritage College, Australia, of course, and taught at the University of Queensland, Hillsong, Tabor, and other universities and colleges in a range of traditions. His paper is titled Exploring the Roles of Religion in the Work of Christian Scientists from Copernicus to the Present.
Yeah, it's terrific to be with you all, and a real pleasure to be able to interact with each one and to hear the wonderful presentations that we've had. And I'm very thankful to ANZATS and also to each one of you for making this a very valuable opportunity. I was raised in an Anglican church, Anglican parents and grandparents, and I saw there tensions between those who placed an emphasis on rituals, more liberal theologians who placed an emphasis on science and reasoning in the present, and those evangelicals who placed more of an emphasis on personal experience. And my participation in the renewal movement and also in Pentecostal and charismatic groups led me further to recognise the value that many saw in an emphasis on the Holy Spirit and a personal engagement with God and faith in God. At the same time, my university studies, bachelor, masters and beyond, have also encouraged me to pursue a more objective understanding of truth. More recently, I've been introduced to the writings of Soren Kierkegaard, who reminds me of the value of subjectivity and agency and the value of the human person. And in my teaching at Alpha Crucis College and Christian Heritage College, I've sought to balance the emphasis between objective study of the natural world around us and the sciences and mathematics with the more subjective understanding that comes to us through the humanities and at times through some aspects of theology. And in one of the subjects in particular that I teach, critical thinking and effective learning, we spend a few weeks talking about the value of science and objectivity and evidence-based information. And then we move on to look at the value of the humanities, looking at emotions and the way they think, the way in which we understand and express knowledge, and also then looking at the role of other areas studied in humanities as well. And we also then move on to consider the creative arts and music and art as further languages in which God speaks, as well as the sense of order in the natural world and the sense of order that can be described in maths and reason. And one is sometimes assumed that theological beliefs and scientific work of scientists who are Christians can be regarded as separate domains. In talking to those who are Christians, often there's been a sense of interplay between one and the other. And a careful study of history by scholars such as Alistair McGrath, Peter Harrison and others shows that throughout history, there's also been a complex relationship between theology and science that shows that theological beliefs and scientific approaches have frequently interacted with each other. And if we look at the history of theological studies, we see that there is similarly an interaction there that continues through to our own day. And so recent studies in the history of the relationship between science and religion by scholars such as Harrison, McGrath, and others reveals some of the complex interactions between the two. And David Lindberg, in his publication, There Is No Warfare Between Science and Religion, observes that the story of science and Christianity in the late Middle Ages and early modern period is not one of suppression of the church or religion, nor support or encouragement, but rather complex interactions between the two. And that like most human relationships and endeavours, this complex interactions include moments of conflict, compromise, understanding, misunderstanding, accommodation and resistance, dialogue and isolation, alienation and engagement, sometimes working together on common causes, and at other times and places going in different directions down different paths. And a number of scholars have pursued further understanding of this complex interaction. Hoggard notes that the major developments that gave rise to the thinking and methods of modern science in the 15th, 16th, 17th and 18th centuries, or 1500s through to the 1700s, often placed an emphasis on the interrelationship between the two rather than a war between the two. And as Peter Harrison argues, the revolution that took place at these times was not accomplished through radical separation of science and religion. Rather, new sciences were often vitally interdependent and dependent upon religious considerations, particularly those generated by the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, which was not only a reformation in theology, but the ways in which the world was viewed and interacted with both benefits and difficulties that arose from this. As Harrison says, these developments in the 17th century led to new experimental methods, engagement with maths and physics in new ways, the idea of science as a collective rather than individualistic enterprise, and also as a vocation and calling. And it revised the ways in which nature and its meanings were understood, viewed, and interpreted. Crucially, the alignment of science with a set of values that could sustain it eventually propelled the Western world in new directions, including participation in industrialization, individualization, and consumerism, and also the financial benefits of these processes. Interestingly, Peter Harrison also noticed that specific theological notions, such as the notion of the fall of man and sin, made major contributions to the development of science and scientific method as scientific approaches by Christians who were concerned about the Adam and Eve story and the notion of sin pursued an emphasis on evidence-based validification. So if we begin with Copernicus, and many scholars have recognized Copernicus' publication of De Revolutionis Orbium Caecilium in 1543 with its radical proposal of a heliocentric cosmology, marked a point of transition, but often not one that is described by those who see a warfare between science and religion. Copernicus' writings marked a change in understanding of some of the most valuable sources of scientific and theological and cosmological knowledge, but often this was seen as a rejection of ancient Greek thinking rather than warfare with religion. Perhaps no other figure at this time who influenced not only theology most, but also inadvertently perhaps was Martin Luther, who's sometimes overlooked for his role in the development of science. Martin Luther's initiation of the Protestant Revolution and transitions in approaches to knowledge from the medieval period to the early modern period was also associated with changes in natural philosophy and scientific inquiry that emerged shortly after this. The Reformation movement led by Luther and other reformers not only challenged the authority of the Catholic Church, but also challenged the authority of Greek thinkers and other traditions, including the writings of Aristotle. Luther's emphasis on personal interpretation and critical examination of religious texts laid groundwork for similar approaches to study of the natural world, as has been noted by other speakers over these 3 days. Moreover, Luther's teachings contributed to cultural and intellectual climate that supported an increased emphasis on scientific inquiry that followed, and an emphasis on the value and priesthood of all believers and all vocations, which included those of science. Thus, the Protestant Reformation hasted the development of modern science by criticising the Vaux-style and intellectual value, not of religion so much, but of scholasticism that was focused on Aristotelism and legal, logical, and rationalistic issues at the expense of genuine moral and ethical problems of the day. And in natural philosophy and science, some answers to these challenges were found. Luther and Calvin both rejected the idea of the vocation of the religious being superior to secular ones, and promoted the view that all people could pursue a greater understanding of the natural world. And Calvin too revolutionized views on theology and contributed to the revolutionary changes of that time. The emphasis on the authority of Scripture, the value of work, the providential view of history, and engagement with the world fostered an environment that further encouraged the exploration of nature and the advancement of what we come to know as science. And Calvin and other Reformation leaders' providential view of history emphasized God's active involvement in the world and saw history as progressing towards a better world. And this motivated many scientific thinkers at the same time to pursue greater understanding of the natural world. It encouraged greater engagement with the world and rejected the monastic withdrawal from secular life. And although primarily associated with later thinkers like Max Weber, the idea of Protestant work ethic can also be traced back to this time and also made a contribution. Perhaps one of the most significant contributors at this time was Francis Bacon. For Bacon, Aristotle's cosmology as well as the theory of science had become obsolete, and he pursued a greater understanding of the natural world by moving on to new ways of viewing the natural world. Bacon's manuscripts mention the doctrine of idols as a necessary condition for developing a constitutive scientia operativa, and in this he again shows the dependence of his scientific ideas on theological concepts. And while some may see Bacon's views as purely scientific and separate from those of religion, this approach fails to acknowledge the important religious and theological influences on his thinking, or his upbringing in a Puritan family and his being tutored by John Wycliffe. The new Organon, where Bacon says that man by the fall fell at the same time from his state of innocency and from his dominion over creation, further describes his building on theological concepts in order to develop his beliefs regarding science and his pursuit of the new Atlantis. And in the New Atlantis, it's an intricately constructed literary work that permeated with religious themes, shows his apocalyptic anticipation of a kingdom of God on earth, in which his contributions to science would also make a contribution. And we can look at a number of other scholars who flowed on from that time. Blaise Pascal is clearly one who has combined theological and scientific approaches. And when we look at Robert Hooke in his Monographia in 1665, we see that in his preface, he also writes about the need to use microscopes, like the use of telescopes, in order to better understand the natural world because of the damage that's been done to our ways of understanding the world through sin. And when we look at Kepler and his work, we see that it was primarily focused on scientific inquiry, but also as a devout Christian, it draws on many other areas as well. Interestingly, looking at Descartes, we clearly see interrelationships between science and religion. Looking at Robert Boyle, he's written much about these relationships that exist between science and religion. A closer look at Isaac Newton's letters and writings shows that he too saw a close relationship in his thinking that he saw as beneficial. Interestingly, if you watch the 2009 movie on Charles Darwin and start to read some of Charles Darwin's writings, you see that he resisted attempts to label him as an atheist, as he wrestles with religious questions just as he wrestles with questions about natural origins. Interestingly, recent understanding of Charles Darwin's grumpiness, which may reflect in a grumpiness in the theory of evolution and competing against things, is not only due to the death of his favourite daughter at her age, about 9 or 10, and death of his father, but also due to what's realised some years later when he gives up drinking milk, eating cheese and putting cream on his food, which you could identify a possible cause of his grumpiness is due to lactose intolerance. And he wasn't able to identify that in his scientific pursuits, which could have changed the course of the way in which we understand the relationship between science and religion. And we could go further by looking at many other scientists, and I suggest that it's well worth exploring a greater understanding of these areas in order that there is a great deal of fruit that can be gained from further understanding these relationships. So this paper has shown that philosophical understandings of science and the methods of science and understandings of theology and the methods of theology shows that they're often interrelated and that there's a great deal to be understood about this. Often it's worth us thinking more about the different types of science, such as an emphasis on empirical study and natural events, which is one particular approach to science in which we look for repeatability and observation, is rather different to developments in science that focus on reason and logic and a bit more like mathematics, less observable, but certainly science draws and interacts with these a lot, and this has connections with idealism and the writings of Plato, and metaphysics can cover all of these areas. And I think it's often important to note that it's very hard for either theologians to avoid having some science in their theology, or for scientists to have some metaphysics in their science. There is aspects of both in each of these areas. And then if we move on to the emphasis on the personal relationship with God, then I think we move on to further areas where it's less easy for science to describe and understand these. Interestingly, Thomas Kahn pointed out that science textbooks tend to mask the squabbles and conflicts that underlie scientific progress. And I think too that religious textbooks often oversimplify and mask squabbles and conflicts that occur there. And so we have a tendency in some science towards methodological naturalism that tends to ignore the complexity of reality. And we have a tendency in some religious developments to ignore the complexities of science. And in teaching my students, I've sought to help to encourage students to be aware of the benefits and limitations of the different disciplines, including the scientific disciplines with its methods and approaches, the humanities with their methods and approaches, the arts, music, visual art, poetry, and their approaches, and the value that all of these can bring towards a greater understanding of God. And of course, I introduce them to Kierkegaard and the argument of the value of subjectivity and agency in their essays. But I'm still very cautious about them writing in the first person in their essays. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam. This is a serious thing, isn't it? You know, how we write and how we ask our students to write. I sort of am a fan of Andrew Louth, who in an essay published in a booklet in the 80s, something small, like under 100 pages, called Discerning the Mystery, something about the nature of theology. Louth says, well, we should actually, in the humanities, theology is included, I assume, we should stop playing the cards of the hard sciences and do our job. So I is there. Anyway, thanks a lot, Sam. Comments, questions? Well, anyway, up until this moment, people were digesting. Now I am certain they are trying to get some rest in the afternoon. At least those on this side of the world. Let me point this out. I think it's very important, Sam. Something you said there. Of course, there are a lot of gems in your talk, but something is very important. The fact that we actually hide behind the finger, both on the, let's say, faith-based education or theological education, and the other side, scientists. The fact that scientists like Hermina cross boundaries is of course beneficial a beneficial trend, but these people are very few. The thing is, we tend to confine ourselves to our very narrow frame of reference, and it's easy to oversimplify both our position and the position of the other. Sometimes we simply ignore the other. And I think what you are conveying here is the fact that even these lessons of history teach a wisdom that is so important to consider as teachers, first of all, and researchers and students and so on and so forth, that listening to the other side is as important as doing our own job in our own backyard. But we have a question or comment from Christopher Catt, please.
Yeah, Sam, it was interesting that you touched on the issue of Darwin, and also in the Reformation, that often science and theology are driven by very human concerns. People's lived experiences are motivating them to look at a subject or unpack something or go searching for an answer. And I think sometimes we can, in theology and science, we can be tempted to try and draw out sort of absolute truths or universal truths or objective truths and remove that element of human experience in the motivation. And it was an interesting, you sort of touched on that in your topic. It's an interesting idea.
And I think people are very much motivated by wanting to bring significant change to the world. And I think one of the problems we do see in our churches is that they isolate quite a lot from the world, and their activities often suffer due to that isolation. And by seeing themselves as providing mainly spiritual answers in a dualistic way, I think they weaken their case. And when they do move into providing food or providing shelter, sometimes again, that's approached in a narrow way rather than a fully integrated way. And we've lost that ability to integrate aspects of our lives. I know teachers who sometimes will stop partway through the day of their teaching to get their students to stand up and dance or stand up and do exercise or something, recognizing the embodied nature of the human person. And I think it's so important for us to always recognize that we are physically embodied, that we're culturally embodied, that we're embodied in time and history and space and geography and culture. And I think all of these influence the ways in which religion and also science unfold. They're always set within certain contexts, which we sometimes don't acknowledge sufficiently. So I think acknowledgement of our context is very, very important.
Very
Other thoughts or questions?
Yeah, and this is actually something that we were supposed to contemplate during these days of the conference, context and tradition, because we have tradition, our framework, and the context is the world where we live, and most times we simply ignore it because we live in ivory towers. Hermina, you have a question or comment?
Yes, I have just a comment. Thank you, Sam, for that talk. I know about how science and faith were closer together back in the days, and I'm just thinking of the challenge it is now. It's easier for me as a scientist, a little bit easier to penetrate the theology field because you guys are so open here, this little circle, but it's very hard the other way around to bring theology into my field. Once I start talking about God and soul, I have to replace these words. Otherwise, I really don't see a way to bring theology into my field. And I'm in the neuroscience, and I appreciate that you talked about the different sciences. And I don't know if that has to do with what you said about, well, in part, there's probably many reasons, but how sometimes we have been understanding the world through sin. Here in my field, we don't understand the world through this lens of sin. I don't know, it's just some ideas, comments I have, and really it's very challenging to, I know, Doru, you said I'm crossing boundaries, but it's very challenging.
Yeah, and I do think we need a greater understanding of human nature that we bring into our theology and the complexities of human nature. One of the dangers of the scientific approach is that it can objectify this understanding. And Christopher, you've made a note in your talks on different ways that human failings and addictions can be viewed, objectification by the medical side of things, and then the religious and theological side and church side can sometimes go the opposite way and say that you are responsible for your own addictions. And where there's a complex interplay between the two, isn't there? Between it's partly the context and the friends that sort of put pressures on you, but at the same time, you have to take some agency in your decision. And I think that's one of the benefits of religion and participating in religious communities, is that they encourage agency in our world. And a healthy religious community will often encourage people to go and study further, to go and engage with their world further. And sometimes people enter religious communities, and in the first few years, they can expand the person and grow the person. And then after 10 or 15 years, they can confine the person and limit the person. So that's worth studying too.
Yeah, and if I may jump in just a moment, I saw you, Glenn. Returning to Hermina's point, I think we have become too accustomed to our metaphors that come from a certain cultural background, from the past, whatever, more recent or otherwise. And living in the world, being realistic about our context would mean we should embrace different metaphors. Let's remember that everything that we find, for instance, in the preaching of Yeshua, of our Lord, it's from everyday life. You move on to St. Paul and you find, I don't know, something that has to do with the Hellenistic culture and so on and so forth. And the same happens through the centuries. But we have become too cozy with our ancient or medieval or early modern metaphors. And we don't take in consideration the metaphors that, for example, Hermina, who is also an artist, by the way, I should have mentioned this when I introduced you. She presents us with these beautiful visual metaphors of the outcomes of her research. And this is, I believe, why we need this kind of conversation between theologians, philosophers, educators, scientists, and so on and so forth. Back to you, Glenn.
Yeah, I'm aware that we've probably run out of time, so don't want to.
From my point, no problem, but if anyone feels like going, please do so. With my thanks.
I'm glad that Hermina feels that we are an open group and that we're comfortable talking about science and the compatibility of science and faith and so on. But, and in these conference spaces, that is very true. But for those of us involved in education, which is pretty much all of us, there can be a bigger barrier to cross with our students who come in having inherited from their ecclesial cultures, especially if they're from more conservative churches, a very conflict thesis idea between science and religion. And frankly, it gets really boring because, you assume the theory of evolution, you assume that when you're reading scriptural stories of human origins, you're not looking for a literal match with evolutionary theory of origins and so on. You want to go on to talk about more interesting things. You want to talk about science and religion in a more constructive way. And it's difficult to do it because you've got to lay down precept upon precept, go back to the ABCs of trying to indicate, that there's ultimately no conflict between science and religion. So recently read John Wesley's interpretation of the fall of humanity, the Garden of Eden story. And it's interesting because as an 18th century person who's fascinated with science, but as also an 18th century person who read the Bible literally, like we would look at the Garden of Eden story and we wouldn't even think about what was the organic connection between the eating of the fruit and the fall into sin. We wouldn't think about that because we would just think, oh, of course, this is metaphor, this is analogy, it's mythology, so we don't need to find a mechanism for why the eating of the forbidden fruit led to human sin. But because Wesley's a literalist and a man of reason and religion, so he's fascinated with science and technology and so on, He wants to find a reason. So he goes into this speculation about how there was some kind of substance within the fruit that had an effect upon the vascular system, the cardiovascular system, that essentially accumulated cholesterol, or he didn't use that term, but that's basically what he's saying, that people's arteries began to be blocked as a result of the eating of the fruit, which is why their lifespan, you know, they no longer had access to the tree of life, to immortality. Now they were condemned to die. So I found that really, really fascinating, that, you know, that we would dismiss it as not needing to be literal. And so we wouldn't need a scientific explanation. But it's interesting to see how models of Christians in earlier eras, sometimes they have different approaches. You know, Doru's mentioned, you know, different metaphors that are employed. And we can sort of forget that there are some other interesting strategies that we might draw upon. Of course, we don't accept the scientific explanation, but the fact that he attempts one was, to me, something very fascinating.
Yeah. Can I ask just a couple of questions? You bring up the challenge of big questions that secular people can ask, and evolution is one. And I wonder whether the way the evolutionary theory was eventually framed when compared with, say, North American, more aligned with theology explanations, etc., ends up being part of the challenge that we now face 100 years later. And whether the long age of the earth, and I'm reminded that the Big Bang Theory can have origins in a Catholic priest's ideas about the birthing of an egg, etc. But also we do have challenges now that we see the long age of the universe of 13.7 billion years. How does God see the world over the 13.7 billion years? Is he interested in the origin of stars and things like that? Do we have some answers to these big questions about the origins of organic life and the origins of the cosmos?
Well, if I may jump in, I keep saying this, you know, self-advertisement. Recently, I finished a small book written with an atheist astrophysicist on the knowns and unknowns of contemporary cosmology, scientific and theological perspectives. And yeah, it's under review at Cambridge Elements. And we talked about this kind of stuff, and I think the models differ, and it depends on the theological models we apply. For example, if we go for the idea of an ongoing divine activity within the universe, then God is not only interested, but very much invested in whatever happens in the universe, from the tiniest grains of matter, energy, information, and so on and so forth, to the high structures and complex structures of the universe. But if we go for this kind of God that picks and chooses, you know, when to intervene and disturb the waters and stuff like that, of course, we have a different kind of understanding. And some models are more open to a conversation with the sciences than others, especially now that, at least in cosmology, but I'm certain the same happens in Hermina's own field, you see more people interested in the spiritual, let's call it so, vaguely, the spiritual. It's very important for us to revise some of our theological assumptions, but also be able to express this kind of theological worldview in ways that become less cumbersome to our partners of conversation, especially scientists, who have heard so many stories about the old guy sitting on the rainbow and throwing thunderbolts at the sinners down here, that they don't want to hear. Again, changing metaphors, I think.
That's so important. I'll just jump in, because last year, for the first time ever in a whole 50-year existence of the Society of Neuroscience, we had a session on spirituality. It was the first time ever. But like you said, Doru, we have to change. I can't go in there and speak with some of the teachings that I was taught in the church. So I don't know. I hope that by integrating with you guys, I can come up with something that you know, to open that door, because there's hunger in my field for something beyond that we haven't cured any of the mental illnesses, so we're beginning to look elsewhere. And I think that there's some opportunity there if we just learn how to talk to each other.
That's the idea.
And it touches on the tension too between the embodied nature, and Nancy Murphy seems to surrender a bit towards that, and the rich tradition we have of that metaphysical understanding that goes beyond the embodied, and then the same with questions of life after death. I wonder whether Hebrew thinking has not always been so keen on life after death, and it probably goes through cycles. But at the same time, there seems to be a lot of argument for life after death, and people are so keenly interested in answers to these questions and looking for more mature answers to these questions that more fully engage with these issues and with the evidence that's presented before them that they can see all around them. We've got this vast advance in knowledge and understanding, but we don't necessarily have advance in the dialogue between science and theology.
We'll have to cut it short. Thank you very much, Sam and Hermina and Chris. It has been such an enriching, challenging, informative session. I'm also very grateful to the audience and the comments and the wit and the questions. Before we go, it's an honor to be able to organize these sessions, the Faith and Science stream, on behalf of ISCAST in Australia and New Zealand Christians in Science in, of course, Aotearoa, New Zealand. And also we are grateful, Nicola, Hoggard, Creegan and I, to ANZATS. Thank you all, and all the best and safe, pleasant, fruitful journeys.
Thank you.